Hey, and welcome to another episode of Plus Three. Today we're joined by Mildred Matt Thought Slime. Great to have you with us, Mildred.
Good to be here.
And we're going to get into some of the utter absurdity that is Jordan Peterson on a few different fronts, ranging from a recent hot water, hot coffee conversation between him and Ben Shapiro, and then going back and looking at some of his influence and interactions with Roland Griffiths. Nishay had actually come across a bizarre, interesting, disturbing conversation between the two of them months ago at this point. And I think when we first saw that, there was a pretty clear sense that we wanted to find some time and chat with Thought Slime about that. And I'm super excited for that. But then more recently, actually, we stumbled across a clip that was promoted on which I don't remember which
Daily
channel.
Wire.
Daily Wire. There we go. Ben Shapiro's outlet. With Peterson and Shapiro getting into some rather mask-off discussion of some of the motivations behind their public engagement. And I think, Brian Pace, you can probably help situate that conversation. Or do you want to look at the clip first?
Well, just real quick, just as some like macro stuff. I mean, because the larger issues that we have, or like the larger interest in putting these clips together, is Jordan Peterson's enthusiasm for psychedelics and the general kind of increasing interest among the right, and especially far right and reactionary actors, for psychedelics in general. And so by putting these pieces together, both Jordan Peterson talking to a very prominent psychedelics researcher at Johns Hopkins, and then talking to Shapiro about his ideas around, conversion therapy and things that have a sordid past with psychedelics. There's a lot of very concerning elements that are worth kind of paying attention to and being aware of as the kind of rightward march into psychedelia continues.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things that we're going to be sort of bookending here is this this porous border of people who are very well established in the psychedelic research community, essentially welcoming Jordan Peterson and his audience/followers into the psychedelic fold, into the psychedelic mainstream, and then Jordan Peterson then turning right around and talking to, one of the hard right ideologues of the public far right American conservative movement, Ben Shapiro. And in doing so, as Nishay was saying a moment ago, we see the mask slip, where a lot of people have forgotten that we really wouldn't know who Jordan Peterson is, although he does have a long career as a traditional academic in the world of psychology. There's many of those people in the world. Why he became famous is because he raised the stink about Bill C-16, an amendment to what effectively is the human, it's a human rights law in Canada, so analogous to hate crimes legislation, to include transgender people. And he waged an exceedingly public campaign trying to reframe this amendment as compelled speech, trying to make it into a free speech issue, that the government would compel him to use pronouns against his will, and that he could be fired and then jailed. And he made this entire thing all the way to the point of being on the BBC talking about how transgender activists are using the same techniques as Maoist revolutionaries. So that's a little context as to really why does Jordan Peterson have an audience? That's the backstory. And so that complicated story that he tells is the fig leaf that Peterson has used to sell right-wing ideas to the general public. It's not about some ick factor around transgenderism. It's not commonplace pedestrian bigotry. It's civilization ending compelled speech by the government. And so let's take a look at this clip.
Just
All
one
right.
thing I would like to add to that.
Yeah, please.
In terms of Peterson's interpretation of the law, claiming that it is compelled speech, his specific complaint was that the bill compelled him to use the preferred pronouns of trans people. And if you actually look at the bill, which I assume everyone here has, because it's literally a page long. It's like a paragraph of text. It's not like this arcane document that you need like to process. It does not contain the word pronoun. It does not contain anything about like how people are spoken to. It merely protects them from hate crimes and harassment, all of which was like already illegal. It's just a clarification, if anything. And the Canadian Bar Association actually had to make a statement saying that no, what you were saying is incorrect. That is not what the bill says. So, yeah, he's just flat out wrong on that.
And to your point, Pace, too, about how kind of the embrace of Peterson by some of the kind of higher up academics in the psychedelic field. I think a lot of us got blocked by Robin Carhart Harris when we told him maybe he should be skeptical of what he's posting about Jordan Peterson on Twitter and things like that. And because he was kind of promoting him as well, alongside Roland Griffiths, who runs Johns Hopkins stuff.
Yeah, and Ferris, and so Tim Ferriss, who's a funder in the psychedelic world, had him on his podcast. Robin Carhart Harris used his immense Twitter following to explicitly recommend this podcast as quote, like a lot of fun. And I put together a Twitter thread that it was confrontational, but I teach some of Robin Carhart Harris's papers in my class. I have respect for some of the scientific contributions that Robin Carhart Harris has made at Imperial College of London, fMRI studies and whatnot on psychedelics. And it was for that reason that it was extremely upsetting to me to see him promoting somebody who built their career on the exclusion of a group of people who, just looking at the numbers, is subject to higher amounts of trauma and mental health difficulties that I thought psychedelics and the mental health revolution was supposed to address in the first place. So I laid some of those complaints out, along with a number of receipts of Jordan Peterson supporting racial intelligence hierarchies with Stefan Molyneux, a white nationalist, and just the other sort of transgender bigotry that he's long had front and center. And I was called a troll. So anyhow, why don't we take a look at where the good Dr. Peterson has taken his deep thoughts.
Sounds great.
The issue that you started to become really politically prominent on, which is the Bill C-16, the gender issue.
Yeah.
That's the issue where now the question that's constantly being asked, so why do you even care? Why do you even pay attention? And the answer is because...
I was asked that earlier today.
Oh, really? What did you say?
I'm not letting the cat have my tongue.
Yeah.
It's like it has nothing to do with gender as far as I'm concerned, or that's peripheral in some sense. So the accusation, why do you care? Fair enough. People are doomed to their own autonomy. But I'm not saying words that other people want me to say. And the idea of compelled speech, it's like the bill was this much about gender.
Right.
And it was this much about,
right.
Oh yeah, the government's going to tell me what to say. Hey,
but
now they're regulating what therapists can say, therapy sessions.
This is interesting because to me, the problem with a lot of this is less a free speech issue, even though I'm on the same page with you. And to me, it really is a fundamental truth issue, meaning that, yeah, you're trying to force me to say something I don't want to say. But to me, the fact that what you're trying to force me to say is so innately opposed to the good is the problem. Like you could try. I would have objections to you forcing me to say that I like a particular movie, right? It may not be true. I don't like the particular movie. It would be bad if you tried to force me to say that. But the level of passion that I have for issues like this one really go to the fact that I think the fundamental good of humanity relies on basic acknowledgments of biological truth, especially when it comes to gender. And then you have kids and you realize that there's a pool in which we are all swimming. And I want my community to reflect some of my values because I don't want my kid to live in the toxic sludge that you are creating for my kid. The insistence is that your vision of yourself be reflected by me in defiance of baseline reality and in order to redefine how society as a whole
Well,
works.
a lot of it's murky thinking. Why insist upon the biological modifications?
Right.
If there's no such thing as sex, it's like, well, what? Then just act out your role.
Right.
Leave your body alone because it's irrelevant anyways. So now in Canada, because they banned conversion therapy, it's now all affirmation therapy.
Right. This is
There's no such
insane.
thing as affirmation therapy.
Right. No, it's insane. I mean, the semantic game that was used in order to say, well, conversion therapy, which was at one time using electric shock to treat homosexuals,
Yeah.
and saying that that's the same thing as you have a gender confused 12-year-old.
Look, I had a 14-year-old kid who was a client of mine. Now this idea is you come to me with an axiomatic claim, whatever it is about your identity, and my job is to rubber stamp it. It's like, I'm not a therapist then. So this is not only insane, this insistence, the notion that therapists affirm is an anti-truth. Let's say you come to me, you have a proposition about yourself, and I say, no, that's wrong. It's like, that's not good therapy. But neither is you have a proposition about yourself and you're disturbed enough to come to a therapeutic session, and I say, yes, you're right. It's like, I don't know if you're right. Mm-hmm. And if you're so right, why are you here?
I think that the cult of authenticity is going to be the destruction of all
stop this for a
psychotherapy, and then.
There's
If
just
you're
too
so
much to
right,
unpack.
why do you
I think-
need therapy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
I think-
you all have a problem with what he said.
Well, you made a couple faces that looked like you were right there cheering them on.
I was fighting the urge, the extremely ADHD urge to just jump in and start talking every time I had a thought. But first of all, very rude of Jerry Seinfeld to leave them waiting so long and not show up to drive them around. I was very upset to see that. But also, like, watching this. I watched not all of, but like you sent me the full thing in context. And whenever you criticize Jordan Peterson, people say, "Oh, you're taking him out of context." I'm like, okay, we better watch the whole thing. I realized something about Jordan Peterson that I'd never quite put together before. But when he says meaning or truth, he means it very differently from the way you or I would use it, because he seems to have this framework where if something is true, it is universally true and applicable to everything. That if there is ever an exception to a truth, then it is untrue in all cases. So when he talks about like therapists do not affirm, that is an anti-truth. Truth must be this axiomatic thing that applies universally, or else it cannot be true. And I suppose in a very specific sense, that could be the case if you're looking for fundamental truth, that like irreducible fundamental truth, but he seems to apply it to just random things. And like, that's where this weird syncretism of his belief comes. Like you listen to him and it sounds like he's speaking just stream of consciousness, but to him, anything that is evidence of a principle in action in one place is evidence of it in action everywhere. And I think that like underlies a lot of his errors in thinking.
Even if those things are appearing in, say, a Disney movie or something, they can then apply that axiomatic truth to the world.
Yeah,
almost especially if it's in a Disney movie, because according to JP's hierarchy of competency, like if it rose to the level of being funded by Disney, it must have been created by some of the most talented and creative minds possible. But we'll get into it later.
Except, Frozen doesn't fit with that.
Well, yeah, no,
So
because it's
He doesn't like Frozen.
he's yeah.
Chaos
No, he
strategy,
doesn't.
etc. There's a tendency, because your brain wants to give him the benefit of the doubt, and say that like, oh, what he's doing is he's not saying that it's true because it's in the movie. He's saying that people believe this, and thus it gets put into our subconsciously, it gets put into art, which would be like a normal thing that people think. But what he thinks is that like the meaning of it, because it's true within Pinocchio, it must therefore be true everywhere, or else Pinocchio's wrong. Like it.
Yeah, I can see that.
Well, and they do this. They do both he and Shapiro engage in a number of constructs and metaphors that they then treat as though the metaphor substitutes for real meaning or analysis. Right. And so, like, once they're able to make their own metaphor fall apart, it's like, well, see, the metaphor can't hold, so the claims people are making about truth aren't valid either.
Yeah.
And I thought
almost
too that go ahead.
Assertion of an axiom that, like, if we accept this, then this argument doesn't work. It's like, but what? Okay, but then maybe the axiom's wrong. Like,
Right.
you know.
For
Well,
for a guy who wrote a book called Maps of Meaning, he certainly has lost sense of the sort of old wisdom that the map is in fact not the territory.
Truly.
Yeah.
And
just
sorry,
go ahead. There you go.
Just as a really brief point, like, and I know it's old fucking news, but the fact that like how the assertions around like moral goodness or truth, or the notion that like somehow whatever gender conversations are an affront to, like, creates a toxic sludge for Shapiro's kid to live in. Like, just the vehemence with which like those statements get made, or the basic biological truths. It's like, really, tell me more about that. Like, let's unpack what goes on like in the study of biology. So.
Now,
Yeah, I think one of the most
do-
disturbing parts of that clip was when Shapiro compares like transgender rights to the good. Like, what is even that comparison he's making? I don't know.
But just to David's point, though, I do think that you know, I could be accused of both promoting transgender rights and creating toxic sludge. That's kind of both of those things are kind of my brand.
Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Yeah, like you say,
overstep
like
on
it's a
that
bad thing, but you know,
Right.
I didn't mean to
Shapiro's
sludge
It
shame
should be
you.
lucky.
And just what I was going to point to at like the beginning of that clip, and we kind of touched on it before, is just that he immediately launches into his well-worn like PC version of his concerns with the bill. You can see him like go into the script of his where he's like, this is a matter of not wanting to be told what to say, and you know, it's just about that, and that's the focus. And then it's upon the slightest prompting, you know, almost like just a gentle push from Shapiro to say, like, is this really about free speech though? Isn't this about transgenders being bad? That all of a sudden it drops away, and he reveals that in fact it's not just a free speech thing. It is about this larger concern about maintaining the dominant kind of hierarchies and power structures of societies.
it's also he says like it's this much about hate speech and this much about forcing people how to speak, and it's like, no, it's a paragraph of text. It is literally like 3 sentences. Like it's.
Yeah.
But if his supporters or listeners or whomever haven't actually looked, then like, hey,
And why would they?
what he's offering? Yeah, exactly.
But also, it's interesting that the way that he constructs transgenderism as a there is this there are masculine traits and there are feminine traits, and that to become transgender is to therefore want to express the feminine traits of like being personable and agreeable, and like that's not at all how like any conversation with a trans person would tell you, like that's not at all what the lived experience of trans people is like. It's like, yeah, if that's what it was, what you're saying would make sense. It would still be kind of shitty of you, but that's not at all correct. Like,
Right. And then doesn't he later on in the interview go on to say that he finds himself more feminine than his wife?
Yeah, and
because
his wife more
like
masculine.
insults him.
yeah,
but at no point-
like, then what does that mean? How is it how's it a
Right,
masculine trait
exactly.
if women can have it and men can have the opposite? Like, doesn't make any sense. It's like
Exactly.
but like, hey, if he like read like some Judith Butler or something, like he could maybe contextualize that and understand, like, you know, they talk about how like divorcing gender from sex as though it's this absurd idea, and then they fucking do it like in the video.
Yeah.
I was totally floored, like the fact that at no point do they talk about where those meanings come from, or like how those meanings are constructed, or like, you know, any sort of social influence on it. And yet, yeah, it was.
There's a point earlier in the conversation when they talk about Jordan Peterson as he affirms the point of view of postmodernists before quickly backtracking, where he talks about how because everything is infinitely complicated and you can never truly understand something, therefore everything can be seen from a multitude of perspectives. And he says that the postmodernists point that out, but their solution to this quandary is wrong of how to understand things then, because they say that everything is understood through power structures, which is, I would argue, very reductive. I don't think that postmodernists argue that things must be understood or can only be understood through the lens of power, but that is through one lens that some things can be understood. But he presents that as like that's absurd, that power could have anything to do with it. And I think that's why he doesn't discuss how those things are constructed, because he can't like, naturally the conclusion to that question is because powerful groups and like where the power resides in society have decided that it is so.
Totally.
Yeah. One of the things that struck me is that Ben Shapiro actually alluded to the grisly history of conversion therapy. And he said, people think about conversion therapy, they think about electroshock therapy. One of the things that we concern ourselves with here is psychedelics, though. And psychedelics were used in gay conversion therapy. And so, one of the things that we really should think carefully about inviting the ideologues like this into the psychedelic space is, what will people like this do once they have affirmed the idea that psychedelics, can be useful tools, and they have an ideological project that they would like to see their ideas reflected in their community, as Ben Shapiro had mentioned, and it's one of these things that's it's part of the history that we're only just now looking at. But like Ram Dass himself actually conducted some of these sessions. Ram Dass was a closeted gay man himself, so there's a lot going on.
And if we look at some of the current research, I mean, including by folks like Robin Carhart Harris, and we look at some of the questions about identity and plasticity and how can psychedelics influence those changes, like there is something to me that I find quite discomforting by the notion of RCH and Roland Griffiths sitting down and not only like welcoming in JP and his ideas, but then broadcasting to their audiences what a fun guy he is and how great the conversation is. And
very quick, so we've mentioned who Robin Carhart Harris is at Imperial College of London, but not everybody is just aware of who Roland Griffiths is. Roland Griffiths has played a role as the director at the Johns Hopkins Psychedelic Consciousness Research.
He's going to get into he introduces him. So
excellent, great.
I
just wanted to make sure.
Yeah, he's going to get into that more specific. If I could just say one thing, just as like bigger context of like what our work at Symposia has been about, is that there's been a lot of kind of corporate push to justify the rapid scaling and expansion of psychedelic medicine, including through monopolistic practices and patenting of indigenous knowledges and methodologies, with the justification that we have to get psychedelics into as many bodies as quickly as possible in order to save the planet. And I'm not exaggerating, like this is exactly what a lot of people are saying. And so if you question capitalism and the kind of collusion of psychedelic researchers with far-right actors, you are jeopardizing the future of the planet, whether it's climate change or political polarization. It's surmised by these folks that, because psychedelics make you feel more connected to nature and to each other, it'll just fix all of those problems. And one of our like kind of larger purposes as an organization is to really challenge that idea by saying psychedelics can be used to further fascist and other far-right agendas in terms of social control and, the policing of identity and things like that. And so that's kind of like just some larger context for these are what Jordan Peterson talks about here. And especially as we get into the Roland Griffiths clip, there are kind of inklings of the potential of things to go in that direction. Rather than just sit back and wait and see, we want to make a point of challenging some of these underlying assumptions and showing that scaling through any means necessary is not going to lead to a better future for all of us.
Right. There are assertions that are fundamentally divorced from material reality. You know, the notion that 2 psychedelic sessions are going to cure people's depression or trauma when they're living with the realities of capitalism day in and day out doesn't really take you very far. So we've got the video. What I would say is we can just start playing it, and if folks want to just jump in, I can stop it.
just jump in and we'll pause it.
So yeah,
That's
feed
great.
those ADHD tendencies and
Dangerous thing to tell me, but okay.
I'm very pleased today to welcome Dr. Roland Griffiths, PhD, professor
Yes.
in the Departments of Psychiatry and Neurosciences and director of the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me. I'm extremely excited about this conversation and have been thinking about it for weeks.
It's a great pleasure to join you, Jordan. You and I met some 15 or 16 years ago at a retreat in California. And frankly, as this work has unfolded and as I've followed your fascinating course, Maps of Meaning, I really became intrigued by having a conversation with you about all this.
I was really taken with our first meeting. I remember that was just before you were about to publish the first of what are really a series of revolutionary papers. And I would say revolutionary not only for their findings, but for the mere fact that they're being conducted at all. The psychedelics
Can we stop
burst
this
into
real
Western
quick?
consciousness in the late 1950s.
So one of the things that when I first saw this interview, the thing I think we both noticed this is that, wait, Roland Griffiths and Jordan Peterson have been friends for, decades?
Since the beginning.
What the heck?
Like, since the
Right.
beginning of the Renaissance is what he's saying, before psychedelics became mainstream.
Yeah. That's
And I think
all
it's interesting too that he says I've followed your kind of trajectory and doesn't bring up any like conflict that
Right.
has he's been involved in.
Yep.
Caused so much trouble and distress that they were rapidly made illegal. And that was the end of research really for 20 years, more than that.
Yeah, more than that.
And I thought that was a complete catastrophe because as a psychologist, my sense was that the most interesting possible domain of study for a truly curious psychologist was the mystical domain that appeared to be opened up by these psychedelic substances, which indicated something that we do not understand, in my opinion, at all.
By the time I got to graduate school, the idea of studying psychedelics was entirely off the table. It was considered a third rail issue to even suggest interest in that
It was
area.
a career-destroying interest. Well, I was so
Yeah.
interested meeting you when we met in California. I was really struck by you in particular because there was nothing about you that I would have associated with the probability of restarting the investigation into psychedelics in the scientific community. And that's the deepest compliment because it seems to me that the reason you were able to pull this off is because you're what would you call it? Surprisingly sensible and level-headed, and actually managed to establish this research program and at such a prestigious university. Why do you think you were able to do
Pause it
that?
for a sec.
Please.
Because he was rich and white. I mean, like, that's a big part of it. It's like, oh, you're just so grounded and wise. It's like, well,
Yes.
there's a lot of other
Wears a
reasons
tie.
why. Yeah, like there have long been other people doing research on psychedelics and other cultures doing research on psychedelics. So it's not as if some magical kind of personality trait of this person is the reason why psychedelics return to universities. So I just wanted to mention that, the kind of like the privilege that's not being spoken of there. And also, I just wanted to, because I forgot to mention this before, the video that we're seeing, because there's a bunch of cuts, I took what was originally a 2 hour or something conversation and condensed it down. So I took out a lot of the ums and whats and kind of, so the content is all there essentially, but it's just been shrunk to be more efficient. So if anyone has any questions, that's how it came to be.
Well, I mean, if you take out the stammering, then you're taking him out of context, and you have to see him with the stammering to understand
Completely
the full
out of context.
Yeah.
I would say that one of the things about Roland Griffiths' involvement in psychedelics is that, he used to be one of these sort of addiction researchers. And so, one of the ways in which he's been positioned as an authority or has built his authority has been somebody who's been perceived to have effectively flipped from skepticism of dangerous and addictive drugs to one who is now a proponent. So there's
And
that
he
as
goes into
well.
that too. He'll explain some of that.
Also,
And kind of
sorry,
I was just going to say the subtext of what Jordan Peterson seems to be referencing too is like that kind of ghost of Leary fallacy of like, oh, if you're not straight laced enough, then people aren't going to take you seriously.
But like,
And that's
to that point, it's interesting that he begins this conversation by saying it was such a mistake that because these things disrupted the status quo so much, they are not to be studied. But what I admire about you is that you don't challenge the status quo and you fit in, and that's what makes it acceptable. So it's like he wants them to be revolutionary and to change things, but also to keep things exactly how they make him comfortable. It's a perfect. Yeah.
One of the things that's always gotten me about that narrative is that like the way it sort of fetishizes this like mythologized lab setting in which like, oh, if it had just stayed in the lab, you know, then we could have had all of these developments over however many decades. And it's like, okay, but if we look at the role of psychedelics in catalyzing certain types or certain moments of thought or action or engagement, it's like while you're lamenting this loss of some mythologized lab history, like you're missing out all of the real contributions that psychedelics made in broader society. And it's like, I don't know that trade-off, you could make maybe an argument as to whether or not it's a net good in any direction, but the fact that they don't even engage with it is just poor thought.
Well, and even I think it's Michael Pollan in his first book, who kind of helped to popularize psychedelics, said that like a lot of the researchers are in the field because they had their own illegal experiences, because it had, you know, due to Leary and all the other people who had popularized it earlier and through Maria Sabina and, you know, various other contributors. It wasn't because they were looking just at the data and were very inspired by the spreadsheets. It was a lot of people, especially in early days, came out of personal experience around other substances.
And there's researchers who other researchers have seen doing drugs who have gotten, you know, on the news and said, oh, I've never done drugs.
Sure. As if we're all supposed to sit here and believe these, right? That these people have gotten into the you know field for you know reasons. Like just I don't know. I'm just interested.
But there's this
and there's also
this desire to like frame it around respectability in a way that's like what they are showing you when they talk about that is that like we want these things in the mainstream, but we want it controlled through like the same mechanisms of academia and corporate culture that like allow us to impose a certain way of being on people. So like
our values,
a white
our
guy
values
in a
are
suit.
continuous.
Sorry. So like a white guy in a suit who talks calmly and appears like he's not gonna like, you know, go off in a wild tangent, like that's someone who should be given authority and should be listened to, even when you're on drugs.
You're allowed to take psychedelics, but only if you compare your experience to the poetry of T.S. Eliot.
Yes, and also like that,
or somebody.
like Michael Pollan is fairly explicit about this. He talks about in How to Change Your Mind how psychedelic experiences can only be valuable if they're mediated by a third party. And it's like
absolute nonsense.
But like it just like in my head I see, and I see like like someone who's about to escape the matrix, but they need an agent there to go, no, what's happening there is you're processing something, you know, like yeah, you could take the red pill, but you have to have an agent with you when you take it, you know, like it's
that's essentially what's being proposed. And when we look at psychedelic therapy and the models that are being proposed, you're literally outnumbered in the room. And all of the other, you know, pundits that are talking about this have been in sort of mainstream psychedelic renaissance speak, have been really pushing this idea of a guide. And ultimately what they're doing is trying to create an industry.
Shall we?
Yeah.
Let's dive back in.
The innocence with which I came into the area. So I came into the area having initiated a meditation practice, and I'd been Yeah, I was trained as a radical behaviorist in psychopharmacology. But even in graduate school, I was curious about interiority and had tried to do some meditation, but like so many, when I tried, it became hopelessly difficult. 3 minutes felt like 3 hours. And so I set that aside. I went about my developing my career in psychopharmacology at Johns Hopkins, became internationally prominent in drug abuse pharmacology, and then 25 years ago started a meditation practice again. And this time there was something fundamentally different about it, and I don't know why, but I engaged with it. There was something really compelling, and it got me reading about different meditation traditions, different religious traditions. I was trying to understand this whole area of spirituality, and then came to be reintroduced. And I was reintroduced, incidentally, by Bob Jesse, who organized that conference we went to. And he's an engineer who founded a group called the Council on Spiritual Practices. And I got reintroduced to the idea, well, Roland, if you're interested in spiritual experience, if you want to investigate that, take another look at the psychedelics. And frankly, my intrigue with the nature of these experiences was so compelling that it made me question whether I should be allocating all my time to running around the world and giving conferences and giving papers and doing studies on the next abuse liability risk for a new compound.
Why do you think your interest in this alternative domain, let's say, became so intense that it was able to displace an already developed expertise and a fully functioning career in this other direction? What was going on?
Well, there's something very compelling about the nature of these transformative experiences. It kind of dwarfed my interest in drug abuse pharmacology to the point that I actually considered at one point dropping out of the scientific academy and going off to India to an ashram to do much more intensive meditation practice. And frankly, I went into that first study, and this may have made me an acceptable person to take this on. I went into that first study with a deep sense of skepticism. I was very happy with what I was learning about the nature of these experiences from meditation. I was kind of put off by what struck me as excessive enthusiasm among those people who have continued to be engaged in psychedelics.
Well,
Good point
enthusiasm
there.
means to be
Yeah,
filled
please.
with...
Yeah.
It's just sort of ironic hearing him say that now, considering that essentially the researchers are the ones with the excessive enthusiasm right now. And it's like, it's Symposia and other people that we're the minority when we're trying to engage, with these researchers in being skeptical about what it is that they're doing, and they're kind of, a lot of people, when you talk to, whether it's Rick Doblin at MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, some of the folks at Hopkins is more, I think there's a more diverse kind of group there compared to some of the other places, but there's a lot of researchers that they feel like they know, with Doblin, what was it? He said that he knew decades ago that this is safe and efficacious, and it's just a matter of kind of going through the motions to get FDA approval and to get their approach to psychedelic medicine
80s,
across across the finish line. So it's just kind of ironic to hear a researcher say that they're the skeptical ones.
How about the fact
right
that you have
now.
a researcher who's talking about the concerns with excessive enthusiasm after he talks about wanting to run away to an ashram and drop out?
That's what I picked up
supposedly
on.
based
Yeah.
on his
Wait, he just
meditative
said he was
experiences. And
He
I
was
want to be
I
clear.
almost pulled a Ram Dass basically, but then I didn't.
And we have no insight into the question of whether meditation is code for something more the notion that, ooh, I returned to meditation and this time it really hit, and then I got involved in psychedelic research. Like, it could just be coincidence. It sounds like a really good narrative. Like, I'm intrigued as to why, when he returned to meditation, suddenly it was so profound that he was considering running away to an ashram. But like,
It could have just
go ahead,
been.
Mildred. It looked like, yeah.
No, they treat this like it's this unheard of, like, what a crazy thing that you had this this life and career, and then you changed interests and wanted to do something different. But like, it's just this, like, people find different religions all the time. It just sounds like this guy kind of just changed his religious views, and that, I mean, I'm using religious in a very broad sense, but like, this isn't like that unusual to me, and it's weird that they're treating it like it's so strange.
Yeah,
Well,
I mean, a lot of
the pace of his life could have just slowed down or something, or something. Yeah, anything.
But even if he is being honest here, there is like a documented history of researchers, like other researchers who have, like Dave was just saying, like, have had psychedelic experiences that then get coded for respectability in ways that, like, oh, I just had a really profound meditation that time, and that's why it, like,
Well,
changed my
I
career
guess
path,
I
or-
assumed that the rest of the story was going to be then he tried psychedelics and had these experiences, but
Well,
it is that I'll be
I
honest,
don't think Roland has ever publicly acknowledged use, or
I
one way
haven't
or another.
seen him. Yeah.
Yeah. So it is,
Also-
But
and
just-
there was, it's worth pointing out, the Hopkins team, so aside from like Rick Strassman's DMT research, which I think was in the late 90s, or well, at some point in the 90s. But
Definitely
like
late
the
90s.
Hopkins were sort of some of the earliest folks in this resurgence, and the fact that there has been a clear and consistent narrative among them that the interest is via meditation. And they've even done some studies like longtime meditators and psilocybin and what sort of experiences are they having, et cetera, et cetera. Like, it is, at least for the Hopkins team, it feels worth showing that those things have traveled together, even if we don't disambiguate or get too like into the weeds about scrutinizing.
Yeah.
Also,
Can we
he looks
jump
like Ron
in?
Paul. Let it not go unsaid.
Spirit, so it's exactly the right word for people who've been
Well-
addled by psilocybin, let's say.
I have to say, I'm very proud of Johns Hopkins as an institution.
It's stunning that they did it. I can't believe that they did it. I can't. What arguments did you marshal to put up against? Because I mean, it's so easy for a committee to, if they see risk, just to say no, because no is simple. The problem goes away, and no one's accountable for it. Yes is complicated, and so like, how did you convince them this was a worthwhile endeavor, especially given your own skepticism at that point?
It really came down to science and risk-benefit ratio. I think the big risk that most institutions would have caved in on is a political risk, a reputational risk. You know what? You know, to be associated with psychedelics, look, that got
Well, look
Harvard
what
in-
Leary did for Harvard.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things that really strikes me about your research program is that it hasn't got out of hand, right? I mean, and that's what happened in Harvard in the early 60s when Leary started playing around, let's say, with LSD, which you don't play around with. You've been able to really keep this within a tightly bound scientific
Beg to
box
differ.
while still investigating and popularizing the reality of the mystical experience for the participant.
I wasn't sure what to expect and whether the effects would live up to the what struck me as exaggerated claims by the psychedelic and enthusiast populations. Immediately during these sessions that are done after careful preparation, so they're really curated experiences in which we meet with volunteers for 8 preparation hours prior to the session, and then they come in, they take a capsule. We ask them to lay on a couch for the duration of the session.
Do they select the
experience.
music or do you select it?
We select it.
What were your guidelines for selecting the music?
Our main guide was Bill Richards, and he had actually done psychedelic work at Maryland Research Center back in the 1970s. And so he had a strong bias toward Western classical music. And so our initial playlist was very strongly influenced in that direction.
So, I mean, you can go on Spotify, and I think we can probably include this in the show notes someplace, and listen to the Hopkins playlist. And a strong Western classical bias is a good way of describing it, but I would call it kind of church music, basically. Not all of it, but there's some choral stuff, and it's just like what they're describing is a very programmed experience, programmed by Bill Richards, while at the same time saying things like, well, you don't play around with LSD and sort of denigrating the community of people who've used psychedelics mostly without mishap for a long time.
It's galling to hear him reduce this boundless mysticism that he claims to venerate and then say, well, what you've done that I really admire is you've managed to put it in a little box, which is I love that.
Yeah.
But like it's frustrating because we have to as intellectually honest people, we have to engage with what he's saying. But in doing that, we kind of have to ignore what his project is, which is he views that mystical experience as a tool to get people to become like Christian, essentially, to adopt his worldview and his certainty in the existence of God. That's all he wants it for. That's what he sees the value of it in. We have to pretend like he wants it for the same reason that you or I would want it.
So he actually ends up going there a bit, and all credit and props to Nishay for catching this in the first watch and like turning around and being like, guys, we have to talk about this. But we're absolutely going there in this video. And in addition to like, let's cram this into a little box, right? Like, let's cram this into a little box that isn't transgressive, that isn't, I mean, explicitly, it's you're not playing around with it. It's not breaking any rules. It's not making a mess. Like,
it hasn't gotten out of hand.
Yep.
Yeah.
Shall we?
Just before we cut back, I just pulled up the psilocybin research playlist on Spotify, and the on Spotify it shows you a couple albums that are a part of it. And one of them is literally Merry Christmas from the United States Military Brass.
Amazing.
Amazing. I mean, it's a bad
that's
playlist.
At least on the Spotify one. I don't know if that's official, but
it's a bad playlist. But if you sync it up to Wizard of Oz, there's a lot of weird coincidences.
I had a mushroom experience where I listened to Be True to Your School by the Beach Boys and just had revelations about how it was all just like an ode to nationalism and was just... music does weird things when you're high.
Since that time,
Any particular composers? Like, was it heavy on Bach, for example?
well, not particularly heavy.
Can I just say?
Music and dancing are...
It's really funny that this point was about like, oh, we had a bias towards a certain type of music. And he's just like, oh, sick. What composers? Like, it doesn't even register to him that would be a problem. He's just like, what composers?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, he
Of course you don't let people
hits.
pick their own music.
Yeah.
It's just very funny to me. Sorry, I didn't mean to.
Psychological scholar in action.
No worries.
Components of psychedelic experiences that stretch back tens of thousands of years. There isn't a tremendous amount of space between classical music and religious music. So there's all sorts of things that you've done that are implicit in the experiment that are integral in some indeterminate sense to the outcome. Now, these preparation sessions, 8 hours. Okay, what are you doing with people during those 8 hours, and why?
The preparation is really developing rapport and trust with them. These experiences can be hugely disorienting, and fear, anxiety can arise at very strong magnitude. It's very important that people feel safe and cared for. They really have to implicitly trust these people to take care of them.
You said they have to feel safe, but I would think that it's more that they have to be safe. I would think that if you didn't have exactly the right sort of people, qualified, intelligent, insightful, competent, caring, awake, all of that, and dedicated to actually taking care of the research subjects, like none of this can be a show for that to work right. Because this can go wrong very badly, and it didn't go wrong. What do you tell the people
Let's
about?
stop here. Because I actually agree with Dr. Peterson at this point.
I was going to say, in a weird way, he's not totally wrong here.
But here's the thing, and this is at the crux of part of why we're having this show, and why I got upset with Robert Carhart Harris on Twitter, is that literally this conversation that Roland Griffiths is having right now with Jordan Peterson, transgender, anti-activist extraordinaire, is just the sort of thing that's going to make an entire demographic of people, feel unsafe. If the head of an entire research institute is chumming up with Jordan Peterson, like how are that patient demographic going to feel that their needs, that their identity is being respected when they're in a vulnerable psychic state? I think it's a real problem.
I think also to kind of synthesize your point just now, and weirdly Jordan Peterson's point, is that it isn't just that trans people would feel unsafe because of this, but that the things that he says have material harm. For example, in that clip with him and Ben Shapiro, one of the things that Ben Shapiro says is that, and Jordan Peterson just kind of nods along with, so tacitly agreeing, it's his position as well, that it is fundamental to our experience of morality that there are a certain acknowledgement of human biology, and this is I'm paraphrasing, but so what he's doing there is this totalizing. Now the idea that sex is inherently biological, gender is inherently biological, and that is immutable, is something that is now foundational to what it means to be a good person. Therefore, anyone who questions that for any reason, based on anything, is a bad person who is trying to fundamentally alter the world and realty and to an explicitly immoral ends. So that is frankly an indirect call to violence. It is saying these people must be stopped by any means necessary. They are doing fundamental evil and trying to erode the values of our civilization. What would you do to stop that? If you believed that.
That's exactly it, and that's why in Brian Pace and my right-wing psychedelia paper in Frontiers, I allude to Alexander Pope's back in the 1700s, his great chain of being idea, because Pope, in my opinion, is like an earlier incarnation of Jordan Peterson, because basically he talks about how everything is interconnected in this great chain of being, connecting the planets and the smallest atoms, and etc., and that anything that tries to go against the established order threatens the entire chain of being. And so it justifies, it puts this great kind of cosmic justification behind stomping down anyone who threatens what is perceived to be the underlying order that maintains the universe. And that's absolutely where Jordan Peterson's going.
I mean, we're talking about sorry,
just on a philosophical level that's so facile and buffoonish, because if indeed everything is connected in this enormous chain, then anything trying to disrupt that chain would be part of that chain. So it's such a contradiction. I don't know how they don't. Frustrating.
But how else will we maintain social hygiene?
Right. And I mean, so here's the thing, speaking of hygiene, because in the paper that is covered as well, and so these ideas that are being expressed by Jordan Peterson, but in the sense that this is a mask off moment with Ben Shapiro and JP just before they get into this conversation that we saw a clip talking about Bill C-16 and what it meant. They were talking about black mold and rot as being a thing that compelled them to action. How they both of them didn't want conflict, but you can't just paint over black mold, and you have to get in there and wreck things to prevent it from spreading. And that's the introduction to the conversation about transgenderism. So
right.
I just wanted to
it's like
make
when something
that clear.
Exactly. And it's like when something's coded as cancer or as black mold, it justifies because it threatens the entire body politic or the entire house structure. It's an act of kindness to hierarchy, to the whole, to stomp that out.
Yeah, and this is language that's problematic, that creates problems, across the political spectrum. Like I think about Chris Hedges calling Black Bloc the cancer of Occupy, and the pushback he got around you're creating a sort of polemic in which you can justify excising, quote unquote Black Bloc anarchists, and that creates real material consequences for folks who put their bodies on the line. So too here, when you're effectively likening trans folks to black mold that needs to be ripped out in order to avoid your house becoming irrevocably contaminated,
It's also kind of deeply ironic that they would use the specific analogy of black mold, a fungus, as this inherently destructive force of and it is obviously it's a toxic substance, but but then go on to talk about the wisdom of the mushroom, and it's just interesting. There's an interesting symbolism to that if you were a fiction writer, there would be a comparison to draw there. I gotta tell you, I'm starting to think this Jordan Peterson guy might not be on the level.
Prepare psychologically for the experience. How do you want them to react?
We want them to go in and be deeply curious about what they have to learn.
Okay. So you want them to be open and let it go and let it happen. And you say, we'll take care of you, but you can let it happen.
Yeah, let it go, be open, trust, and
Will you pause it
and
really
we prepare them to...
I thought he didn't like Frozen.
That's what I was thinking. Anyway,
sorry, I didn't mean to steal that.
To not necessarily expect, but not rule out the possibility that what may emerge during the session is something that they'll find absolutely terrifying or anxiety producing.
Okay, so they know that.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
I think it's actually a very sobering statistic that in spite of all the selection we do, we've already screened out people for whom we don't think we can develop rapport and trust. We've screened out individuals with borderline personality disorder, for instance. And so we've already selected a group of people who are open and curious. We're giving them all this time and attention, yet about 30% will experience some significant anxiety during those sessions. Most people, even if they have...
No explanation on that? Just people we can't build rapport with, people with borderline personality disorder. What? Pardon me?
This is a longer and bigger conversation. But yeah, borderline personality disorder individuals have been somewhat stigmatized within the psychedelic community.
Highly
going way
stigmatized.
Back. Way back.
A lot of
kind of the thing that you see. Nishay, I think you're probably going to say what I was saying, so all you.
Oh, I was just saying with the Power Trip podcast that Dave and Lily, who's not here, have been kind of co-producing with New York Magazine. We even see in that where a lot of bad behavior that happens in psychedelic therapy contexts is written off as, oh, that was just a borderline person who is hallucinating harms. This isn't something that is justified or anything we have to question about the people abusing power in this context. So that it's part of that larger history. And just one other thing is like I feel like borderline's actually one of the indications that like could be very like helped by psychedelics, because your usual defenses, your usual things that kind of come up and get in the way of trusting and all of the rest can be different because you're in a different headspace. And so the fact that it's been selected out in that way is unfortunate.
Nishay, I don't know if you saw this, but there was actually a recent paper proposing using psychedelics with borderline people, sort of bucking this trend. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly not the kind of non-starter that has been made out to be. And just to be clear, a lot of the people who are written off as borderline, they're effectively being retroactively diagnosed by therapists who don't want to address the fact that they've done things that they shouldn't be doing.
Well, and like Nishay said, I mean, we've seen it a lot with the consciousness medicine cluster of like underground practitioners, where they have resorted to making claims. Even, you'll have underground practitioners telling one client that another client has borderline in an attempt to avoid stories about potential impropriety or wrongdoing getting shared among communities of clients, of people, or even of their peers, right? Like a peer hears that a fellow underground practitioner has engaged in impropriety, and it makes a rather convenient narrative to say, oh no, that person's just borderline, they're out to get me, this, that, and the other. And I think there's also questions, we may end up looking at this a bit in part 2 of Power Trip, but questions about if that borderline narrative crops up in clinical trials, and if you get just around selection criteria, and if that narrative is weaponized more thoroughly throughout the field.
Well, I just think it's interesting that his justification here isn't that it's like controlling for that, which I think would be understandable if he's saying I want to test specifically on neurotypical people to see the results in, like, it's a variable I don't want to account for. That would be one thing, but and there would be ethical concerns there as well. I don't want to present that as like an uncomplicatedly good thing, but the specific reason he gives is that you wouldn't be able to build rapport with them, which is fucking
it's
wild.
in the literature. It's in the literature. So if you go back to Leo Zeff's account, it's Stolaroff,
the secret chief revealed.
Yeah, Stolaroff sort of summarizes Leo Zeff, who is the secret chief, as his view on borderline individuals. He paraphrases as let's see if I can remember exactly, help refusing complainers. So this is part of the sort of long-term training in psychedelic therapy, that somehow borderline personality affected people are not welcome.
And it is worth noting, and this might seem like a little bit of a tangent, but like the sort of research that was going on until like the last couple years, it was not pharmaceutical research. So like the research that Hopkins and other academic institutions were doing, it was like they were asking questions about effects and sort of doing these studies, but there was no aim at producing a pharmaceutical intervention as the result. And so when you look at some of the, like, I appreciate the point about like controlling variables and this, that, and the other, but like the sort of trials that were being designed and run, what they were considering both as far as like the sample sizes, the population sizes in the trials, we're talking really small numbers of participants. We're talking about like sort of more open-ended, less sort of, what would you call it? Like interventionist centered approaches. And so like even around the variable stuff, like you could say these could have been a little more loosey-goosey than you might expect from like a clinical trial focused on pharmaceutical drug development. And even there, it's like, the fact that just sort of slips in as a rationale, I think does raise some interesting questions.